So when we talk about the history of the United Church of Christ, we often speak of UCC as having four streams that merged into two that eventually became one river. And that first stream is this church, congregational tradition. You know that congregational churches, many of them are older than the United States itself. Church of the Pilgrimage in Plymouth, Mass, celebrated its 400th birthday in October. And so, yes, that means that some of our congregational ancestors were pilgrims and Puritans, which is a fact that some look upon with pride, and some with hesitation, and some have scorn, but it is our heritage. The first wave of them were seeking freedom from religious persecution. Sadly, they went on to do some religious persecuting of their own, if you know U.S. history. Our family closet, like all of us, has some things in it. But the point I want to make is the Congregationalists didn't have as big a concern about what one believed as much as the congregation has its own authority. That was like the height of the theological concern. Otherwise, beliefs were quite diverse. So there were two streams involving German immigrants. The first was a wave that came in the 1700s, fleeing war and poverty, and they were from a Reformed tradition. They centered around Philadelphia and expanded out from there. And the second wave came in the mid to late 1800s and were centered around St. Louis and beyond. And they also were fleeing war and poverty. And the second group were known as evangelicals, but not the small e evangelicals of today. Have nothing in common whatsoever, not the moral majority type, because this group was quite broad-minded. And in fact, they were a middle way between strict, rigid doctrine and secular rationalism. The motto they had was, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, diversity; in all things, charity. So these Reformed immigrants and these evangelical immigrants, they found some commonality and joined together to form one stream known as the very imaginative name Evangelical and Reformed Church. And per capita, for their size, this group founded more human service and healthcare institutions in the United States than any other group, any other religious group, including the largest hospital systems in Chicago and St. Louis. Focus with love, showing love. So then there's this fourth stream, a group known only as Christians. A disparate group of former Baptists in New England who believed in universal salvation, as in there's no hell. And among them were some of the earliest women preachers in the United States, including Nancy Dove in 1820. This also included a group of former Methodists in Virginia who wanted to be free of authoritarianism by bishops. And then a group of former Presbyterians in Kentucky who embraced frontier revivalism. This disparate group wanted nothing of denominationalism and united around some common principles, which they later realized if you want to get something done, you kind of need a sort of structure, which they reluctantly decided would be a denomination, but only known as the Christian churches, which found commonality and joined together to form one stream with the congregational churches, who had another very imaginative name, the Congregational Christian Churches. These were our four streams that became known as the one United Church of Christ in 1957. The motto from our founding is that they may all be one. But there was one more group that I guess no one quite knew what to do with. Because they didn't fit exactly this narrative and were ignored. That's the charitable view. The group was black. So we might say they were dismissed. But whatever you say, at the founding of the UCC, they were absent. The Afro-Christian connection, or Christian convention, centered in the Tidewater region of Virginia and in North Carolina, kind of got lumped into the rest of the Christian churches, but they're distinctly different. These are churches that are not centered in whiteness. They were not founded by white people. They were not offshoots of white churches. This did not involve people leaving the balconies of white churches to create new denominations. No, this unique group, immediately after the Civil War, people who had been enslaved and still practiced aspects of religious tradition passed down from their descendants in Africa, they started churches and more churches and created their own structure of cooperation and fellowship and even founded a college. One of my favorite stories about this college, Franklinton, is that all the members of these tiny little poor churches were taxed 10 cents to create a college that had students from kindergarten on through college degrees. There was such a lack of education. You know, if you have an image that all UCC churches worship in a, relatively similar way, for example, we sing hymns and we listen to prepared sermons quietly. Churches of the Afro-Christian tradition in the UCC are lively and free-spirited and are influenced by African rhythms. In the absence of these members at the founding of the UCC, the absence of their story in the telling of our history as four streams was confessed at last summer's General Synod, along with an official apology and a commitment to their inclusion in the teaching of our history as the rightful fifth stream in the UCC. Now, I've taught UCC history at seminary in Denver for 10 years, and I've always included their story as a hidden history, but not with the perspective of the Afro-Christian Convention as a fully equal part of our history. And that now changes for all of us who teach history. African Americans have been part of the tradition of the Congregational Church in the history from the beginning, but was more often as subjects of mission than agents of mission. Upon becoming a Congregationalist, black members of black churches were expected to adopt a white style of worship, a superior style of worship, singing European hymns, and a theology shaped by Europeans, addressing issues of interest to Europeans, but not for those who were living in the reality of a Jim Crow world subject to lynching and exclusion from decision-making in society. And white churches may have talked about these issues on occasion, but not in the way that reflected the daily lived experience of racism. When the Congregational Christian Church was founded in 1931, black Congregationalists and Afro-Christians found one another, but struggled to find common ground, with vastly different styles of worship from one another. Black Congregationalists were often the well-educated upper crust of the black community in the places they lived. Afro-Christians were not, which led to their feeling marginalized. But slowly and deliberately, the two groups nurtured a relationship of family and common purpose that was, unfortunately and ironically, interrupted by the formation of the UCC. You see, in the new UCC, churches would be integrated into geographical conferences, and of course integrated only seems right, but it isolated these congregations one from another, which further led to their marginalization and the absence of their history. It seems impossible to think that a denomination that talks a lot about racial justice failed to talk with and include its own black members. It's impossible, and yet it's so common, you don't even notice it. At least we who represent the dominant majority, who either intentionally or unintentionally, set and maintain the expectation of what it means to be the UCC. That's changing. One of the fastest growing church groups in the UCC, and yes, there are growing areas of the UCC, are congregations of Black, LGBTQ Pentecostals. Now, it seemed logical, I guess, that they would be welcomed into the UCC, but is the UCC ready to be welcomed into them? Not for them to change to fit us, but for us to change to fit them and get rid of all that whole us and them framework, right? But there is actually a model for this unity that comes straight out of the Afro-Christian tradition. And they're known as the 5 principles. I'm going to share those with you. First, Jesus Christ is the only head of the church. So what does that mean? It means the head of the church is not a pope or a bishop, and not even the people. Christ alone is the head. And one of my favorite lines is the lady woman who told her pastor, Jesus is the head of this church, pastor, not you. Number 2 is Christian is a sufficient name for the church. They resisted these labels and names like Presbyterian or Methodist or Congregational. They preached no sectarian divides. Number 3 is that the Holy Bible is a sufficient rule for faith and practice. What does that mean? It means no creeds, no indoctrination, just the Bible. But they were not literalists. They had women preachers because they saw evidence of it in the Bible. Now, literalists would say women should be silent in the church. Number 4 is that Christian character is a sufficient test for church membership. Which is to say, membership isn't about being able to recite a creed or answer specific dogmatic questions. The only thing asked, do you want to live a Christian life? Now, I suppose they still needed some way to talk about what that meant, but the point is that they didn't want to exclude people for having the wrong beliefs. So we have Jesus Christ, the only head of the church. Christian, sufficient name for the church. Holy Bible, sufficient for faith and practice. Christian character is what we measure for church membership. And 5th, and this is the big important one, the right of private judgment and the liberty of conscience. There are rights and privileges to be accorded to and exercised by all. Big one. People have a right to decide what they believe for themselves. They affirmed our consciences as valid interpretations of belief, not what some outside authority tells you to believe. That's kind of radical. Imagine hearing that in the 1800s, but in fact, it might be unacceptably radical in some churches today. But this is what Afro-Christians who were shaped and formed by African religious practices found in common with Baptists who didn't believe in hell, Methodists who didn't want bishops, Presbyterians who believed in the altar call, and this is how they found each other to cooperate as Christian churches, who came together with the Congregationalists who also held quite diverse beliefs, added to the ENR church with its mottos, in essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity, in all things charity. That's us as the UCC. But from this point forward, a story in which one of those streams is not absent. So I want to bring it back to our own faith stories. You heard me repeat those phrases, those statements, or the 5 principles. Well, what do you think? First one was, Jesus is the only head of the church. Does that differ at all from how you may have been raised? And that Christian is a sufficient name. You think back about the names of the denominations you belonged to in the past, right? Catholic, Episcopal, Methodist. But do we need These labels, more labels, even the UCC, does anyone outside our churches care at all about these names and labels? The third is the Bible is a sufficient rule for faith and practice. And I wonder, were you raised in a tradition of creeds and doctrines and the importance of those? And that Christian character is enough to join a church, which could be a tricky one because, whatever church decided, something about you is not Christian enough. But really, their concern, again, was about creeds and doctrines and authority. And the last one, private judgment and the right to follow your conscience. Does that sound like what you grew up with? Does it describe who you are now? And if it does, you might be UCC. So here's to our fifth stream. Wish I had more time to tell some stories, but we do need to move on because in our tradition, 1 hour is enough.